Despite the Walking Dead universe spanning 5 shows across almost 15 years, there's one insane collapse fans have never actually gotten to see: New York City. So today I'm going to be piecing together every single thing that's actually confirmed about the fall of New York City, using the little, hard to find, and mostly hidden information we have. Most of it comes from one survivor, Amaya, recalling life as a kid in Manhattan when the trials began. But between her account and what the lore confirms, there's enough to reconstruct how America's biggest city really ended up sealed off from the mainland and crawling with over 1 million walkers. So let's get into it. The trials reach Manhattan. The thing that made New York the greatest city on Earth is the exact thing that killed it first. Not the virus, not some weakness in the walls, the subways, the density. 1.6 million people packed onto a single island, stacked in towers connected by tunnels that run under the whole thing like veins. That system moved people faster than any city in the world. When the outbreak hit, it moved the infection just as fast. Dead City calls Manhattan the epicenter, not a city that got hit hard. The epicenter, the place the whole disaster radiates out from. And once you understand how the island is built, that stops being a coincidence and starts looking like the only possible outcome. Picture the subway system for a second. Dozens of lines, hundreds of stations, all of it packed underground and feeding straight into buildings holding thousands of people each. That is not a city. That is a machine built to move bodies through enclosed spaces at maximum speed. Nobody designed it to spread a virus, obviously, but you would be hard-pressed to design something better for the job if you tried. None of this plays out on screen minute by minute. There's no news footage, no countdown clock. What survivors like Amaya and Tommaso describe later, and what the animated opening shows in flashes, all points the same direction. The infection moved through those tunnels and up through those buildings before any real evacuation had a chance to form. Every account agrees on the speed. None of them agree on the exact hour it started, because by the time anyone was in a position to keep track, it was already everywhere. The show describes it spreading like wildfire, and that is not just a dramatic phrase. Wildfire does not spread evenly. It spreads fastest where the fuel is already connected, dry, and packed close together. Manhattan was exactly that, just built out of people instead of trees. So the island that could move 1 million commuters in a single morning used that same efficiency to move something that could not be stopped. The strength became the trap. And for the people who actually lived through it, the horror did not start underground at all. But the spread through the tunnels was only the quiet part. What the native New Yorkers actually remember first isn't the infection at all, it's something falling out of the sky. Bodies rising and falling. The first walker most native New Yorkers saw in Manhattan did not stagger out of an alley. It fell out of the sky. Forget the shuffling corpse in the street. Dead City opens with something the franchise had never actually done before. Reanimated bodies dropping from windows, ledges, and rooftops, crashing onto the pavement below like the city itself was shedding its dead. One recap called it exactly what it looked like: raining bodies. Human-sized hail falling 40 floors onto concrete. The official version of a zombie outbreak is simple. Somebody dies, somebody turns, somebody shuffles toward you at ground level. That is the entire model the franchise ran on for years. Across farms and prisons and small towns where the worst thing above your head was a water tower. Manhattan broke that model on arrival. Every building in this city is a shelf. Every shelf had bodies on it. When noise woke the dead throughout the premiere, they did not just stand up in hallways and apartments. They stumbled toward windows they could not see clearly anymore, and gravity did the rest. Survivors on the street were not just watching their left and right anymore. They were watching straight up, because a corpse fresh off apartment 42 could end you before it ever opened its eyes. That is the part that turns this from a scary scene into a structural nightmare. Verticality did not just spread the outbreak faster, the way it did across the first section's exploding population density. It changed what danger even looked like once the outbreak was already loose. In every other town in this franchise, clearing the street below you meant you were safe. In Manhattan, clearing the street meant nothing, because the street was never the only place the dead lived. For the ordinary people trapped in this, that is not a fun fact. That is Amaya and Tommaso learning in real time that there is no floor high enough and no rooftop low enough to actually be safe, that the sky itself had joined the threat list. A city built to make you feel small and protected by all that concrete and steel instead turned every one of those buildings into a loaded threat pointed straight down at your skull. Living under a sky that rained the dead, the survivors did the only rational thing left. They held on. They looked toward the mainland and told themselves that somebody, somewhere, had a plan to fix this. and that all they had to do was outlast the falling bodies until that plan arrived. They held on for weeks. They should have known better. The rescue that vanished. The worst part of Manhattan's collapse was not a bite, a fall, or a locked door. It was a rumor. Somewhere in those first days, word spread that the army was coming, and that single sentence kept thousands of people exactly where they were standing. The wait itself became the trap. Manhattan got treated like a major emergency zone from the start, and on paper that sounds reassuring. Then you realize what that actually meant on the ground. It meant radios, it meant briefings, it meant maps with the island circled in red, all of it moving at the speed of a bureaucracy, while the outbreak moved at the speed of a subway car full of the infected. Bureaucracy does not sprint. The dead do not need to. Civilians did not know that gap existed. They only knew what they had been told. Secure the perimeter. Hold your position. Help is coming. So they held. Amaya held. Tommaso held. Week after week on rooftops, watching the streets fill up below them, still repeating the same story to themselves, because the alternative was admitting nobody was coming at all. Nobody wants to be the one who blinks first on hope. So they kept scanning the skyline instead, and the city was already answering that question for them, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Every single day the response lagged further behind the collapse, and every single day the math got worse. This was not a slow leak the army could patch with enough time and enough radios. It was an entire island turning over in real time, and the response on offer was built for a crisis that unfolds over weeks. What Manhattan was living through ate itself in days. By the time anyone with real authority looked at Manhattan and asked if it could still be saved, the honest answer was already no. The density that made the city legendary, the population stacked 20, 30, 40 stories into the sky, was the exact same density that made it impossible to stabilize once the dead got loose in the tunnels beneath it. Nothing in canon spells this out directly, but the outcome writes it for you anyway. An island that ends up sealed off completely was never an island anyone seriously planned to walk back into. So the tragedy was never just that the rescue failed. It is that hope kept people in place long enough for the failure to become fatal. Every rooftop vigil, every night spent scanning the skyline for helicopters that were not coming, was a night someone did not spend finding their own way off the island while the streets below were still passable. The thing keeping them alive and the thing keeping them trapped were the exact same feeling, wearing two different masks. Hope does not announce which one it's wearing. And then, after all those weeks of scanning the horizon, the help finally showed up. That should have been the turning point. Instead, it was the moment everything got worse. The military finally arrives. The army finally showed up in Manhattan. That was never good news. Weeks of watching the sky for helicopters, weeks of rooftop signal fires, bedsheets spelling out help on water towers, people burning through flares they couldn't afford to waste. And when the uniforms actually arrived, they weren't there to get anyone out. They were there to make sure nothing got out. That's the twist nobody on those rooftops saw coming, because nobody up there was thinking about the city in those terms. They were thinking about themselves, about their own street, their own building, their own chance at a helicopter that was never coming for them specifically. It never was. Manhattan wasn't treated like a city full of people anymore. It was treated like a wound, the outbreak's epicenter, the place where the infection was worst and moving fastest. And that single designation is the only thing that mattered from that point forward. Not the island, not the history packed into it, not the millions of people trapped inside it. Amaya didn't spend those weeks waiting to be liberated. She was waiting to be evacuated. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is exactly what the military showed up to enforce. This is Operation Cobalt, the same containment doctrine getting applied everywhere the dead were spreading fast enough to outrun a rescue effort. Cobalt was never a save the city plan. It was a stop the bleeding plan, and Manhattan qualified as one of the worst bleeds on the entire eastern seaboard. When a place earns that kind of designation, the math changes completely. You're no longer counting how many people you can pull out. You're counting how many people you can keep in. Simple as that. No asterisk, no exception clause, no version where Manhattan gets treated differently because of who or what it used to be. So the soldiers came. Fans still argue about what that arrival actually meant, whether this counts as the military abandoning Manhattan or just showing up after the window for saving it had already closed. Nothing in the official record spells out a betrayal in so many words. But line up the containment priority, the epicenter designation, and the total absence of any large-scale evacuation, and there's only one conclusion left standing. This was never a liberation force. It was damage control that happened to be shaped like an army, boots and rifles included, and dressed up just enough to look like Hope from a rooftop 300 feet up. Think about what that does to a person watching those trucks roll in. Tommaso doesn't know any of this. He just sees green uniforms and thinks the nightmare is ending. He has no way of knowing the operation he's watching unfold was built around a number, not a name, and that number was never his. It was never going to be his. Nobody radioed ahead to tell him that. That's the cruelty hiding under the relief. Help arrived, technically. Just not the kind anyone up there had spent weeks praying for. Cold comfort, but comfort was never really on offer to begin with. It rarely is once a city gets reduced to a containment statistic. But arriving to contain a city is one thing. What they did next was the point of no return, the single decision that turned an island of survivors into a tomb with the door welded shut from the outside. Operation Cobalt. The military didn't quarantine Manhattan, it amputated it. That distinction matters because most people hear outbreak containment and picture checkpoints, maybe some barbed wire, a National Guard truck parked at an on-ramp, somebody with a clipboard checking papers. What actually happened was faster than that and a lot more permanent. Every bridge and every tunnel connecting the island to the mainland was destroyed on purpose by the same government everyone on those rooftops was praying would show up. It showed up. It just came with explosives instead of buses. Manhattan was named as one of the outbreak's epicenters, and that label is exactly why it got this treatment instead of a normal evacuation. Epicenters don't get rescued. They get sealed. The Brooklyn Bridge, the tunnels running under the Hudson, every single crossing that a person could have walked, driven, or crawled across to get off that island, all gone in one coordinated demolition. Dead City later confirms this directly as the cause of Manhattan becoming its own separate world of the dead, cut off completely from everything else. Think about what that decision actually required. You don't blow up a bridge by accident. Someone calculated the charges, picked the timing, and pulled the trigger knowing full well there were still people alive on the island side. Amaya was one of them. Tommaso was one of them. They'd spent weeks watching bodies fall past their windows, waiting for exactly this kind of military response, and the response finally arrived as the sound of their only exit routes turning into rubble in real time. This wasn't a lockdown. Locked doors can be opened again. What happened to Manhattan was closer to surgery, the kind where the doctor decides the infected limb isn't worth saving and removes it entirely rather than risk the rest of the body. Except the limb was 1 million living, breathing people, and nobody asked a single one of them how they felt about the amputation. The horrifying part isn't that the military acted, it's that this was their most competent, most decisive, most well-executed action in the entire collapse. No confusion, no delay, no half measures, clean, fast, effective. And every ounce of that efficiency got spent locking the exits instead of opening them for the people still screaming behind them. With every way out gone, nothing could leave the island, and nothing could stop what was already inside from growing. The dead didn't just stay. They gathered in a number the mainland could pretend not to imagine. The million-walker horde descends. 1 million walkers. Not an estimate, not a rough guess. That is the number the wasteland settled on for what Manhattan became. Say it slow and it still doesn't land right, because 1 million of anything is hard to picture, let alone 1 million corpses stacked shoulder to shoulder through Midtown, spilling into every side street that used to matter. The seal didn't just trap the living. It trapped every single death that came after it. Every bite, every infection, every person who didn't make it stayed exactly where they fell, because there was nowhere left to drain to. Bridges gone, tunnels gone. No outlet, no thinning, no herd wandering off toward New Jersey to become someone else's problem. Manhattan became a closed container for its own body count, and the math only ever moved in one direction. Nothing left, nothing lost, just accumulation. That is what containment actually costs, and it's a cost nobody advertises. Seal a city, and you don't stop the dying. You just stop the dead from leaving. The number itself isn't a body-by-body tally. Nobody stood at the Manhattan Bridge with a clicker counting corpses as they piled up, but treat it as the honest scale of what the island became, and the picture is worse than any exact count could ever be. At 1 million, Manhattan stops being a city with a walker problem. It becomes something closer to a walker habitat, with streets that function as game trails and avenues that behave like migration paths, carved by something that used to be human. The dead weren't roaming through geography anymore. They were the geography. That reframes everything the mainland was supposedly protecting itself from. This wasn't a herd anyone could hope to clear with enough guns and enough time. It was weather. You don't fight weather. You wait it out or you get out of its path. And somewhere under all that weather were people like Amaya and Tommaso. Still alive, still rationing, still watching the streets fill up with the very thing the army promised to handle. Every week the horde grew was another week, proving the cavalry wasn't coming to fight it. You don't leave a million walkers to fester in a city you plan on reclaiming someday. You leave them there if you've already crossed the island off the map for good. A city with 1 million dead in its streets should be a city with 0 living left in it. That's the clean version. The version that makes sense on paper. The version any sane person would bet on. And yet somehow, against every bit of logic the horde represents, people were still up there. Still breathing. Still eating. Still moving. Just never anywhere the dead could reach. Life above the streets. Nobody in Manhattan walks anywhere anymore. They fly, tethered to a cable, 10 stories above ground that used to be theirs. The rule is simple and nobody breaks it. Stay above the 10th floor or don't stay at all. There's no negotiating that number, no clever exception for a quick errand. The streets that once carried 8 million people to work now belong entirely to the dead, and the survivors who made it this far learned that lesson the same way they learned everything else in this city, by watching someone else learn it first, usually the hard way, usually only once. So they built up instead of out. Zip lines run building to building across the island, strung high enough that nothing below can reach them, and they've become the actual transit system of a city that used to brag about its subway. That's a genuine downgrade, and everybody up there knows it. You clip in, you cross, you never look down longer than you have to. Rooftops that once held nothing but AC units and pigeons now grow food. Real hydroponic farms stacked on top of skyscrapers because the ground is no longer available for something as basic as agriculture. Entire blocks of vertical infrastructure, apartments and gardens and rope lines, built on the assumption that the Earth itself is enemy territory now, permanently, with no plan to ever reclaim it. Think about what that actually means. This is the same verticality that turned Manhattan into a kill box in the first place. The density and the height that dropped bodies out of windows and turned every stairwell into a funnel. Now it's the only reason anyone's still breathing. The thing that doomed the city is the thing keeping it alive. And that's not victory. That's a civilization that surrendered the ground floor permanently and called the compromise home. Somewhere under all that rope and rooftop dirt are people like Amaya and Tommaso, ordinary New Yorkers, who spent their first weeks up here just watching, waiting for the ground to become theirs again. It never did. What they got instead was a life measured in floors, where success means never touching pavement again as long as you live. 10 stories up stops being a rule after a while and starts being the only version of home they remember. That's not survival with an end date. That's survival as a permanent condition, a truce with the horde that only holds as long as nobody comes down. But surviving above the streets was never the same as owning the city. Watching a horde from a rooftop is not the same as controlling what happens on the ground beneath it. And that gap is exactly where the real trouble starts. Give people enough years on an island no one is coming back to claim, and survival curdles into something else entirely. Territory, borders, and rulers. Isle of the Dead. Nobody ever declared Manhattan dead. That's the part that should bother you more than any walker count or body pile. There was no ceremony, no announcement, no final broadcast telling the world the island was gone. The mainland just stopped showing up, and stopping showing up turned out to be its own kind of verdict, quiet and permanent, and never once revisited. Years after the bridges came down, Manhattan is still out there, still cut off, still surrounded by water nobody's crossing in either direction. No unified authority runs it, no government, no military, no rescue operation quietly wrapping up business before pulling out. Instead, you get factions carving the island into pieces and defending those pieces with whatever they've got. The Croat holds what he holds through fear and reputation alone. The Barazi carve out their piece and defend it the same brutal way. The Manhattan tribespeople claim their share of the ruins and hold it exactly like everyone else does, by force, because force is the only currency anybody bothered to leave on the island. This is where the whole thing lands. Every rung of this story, the tunnels they flooded, the bodies raining off the rooftops, the soldiers who came promising rescue and delivered a wall instead, the exits they blew to make sure nobody wandered back out, the corpses stacked and counted like inventory in a warehouse nobody wanted, the survivors stranded on rooftops waving at helicopters that never landed. All of it points at the exact same conclusion. The factions ruling Manhattan now aren't a comeback story, and they were never going to be one. They're what fills a vacuum the outside world created on purpose and never once tried to undo. Think about Amaya and Tommaso again, the ones who spent weeks on those rooftops counting bodies and praying for an army. The army came. It just wasn't there to save them. It was there to make sure they stayed exactly where they were, permanently. Along with everyone else, the mainland had already written off and stopped counting. That's the trade nobody warned them about going in. Hope walked in wearing a uniform and left with the bridges detonated behind it, and nobody ever came back to explain why. So the ruins that grew after aren't really a wasteland, and they aren't really a civilization either. They're both stacked on top of each other, the dead ruling by default and the living ruling by force. Both of them permanent fixtures now, neither of them going anywhere soon. The animated opening of Dead City doesn't call it a war zone or a quarantine or a disaster site. It calls it exactly what it became, plainly, without any softening. The Isle of the Dead. Manhattan never got a funeral. It got a border instead. The island didn't die the moment the dead rose in its streets. It died the moment the people across the water decided the million souls trapped inside were already the enemy. And every faction fighting over the rubble since is just proof that decision was never meant to be temporary. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.